From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here, and here's what's coming up. K-State's Dorivar Ruiz-Diaz will talk about Topdress Fertilizer applications to winter wheat, the importance of application timing, nitrogen source selection, application method, and making a decision on the application rate. He'll cover all of that next. Then from the Washburn University School of Law, Roger McEowen returns for another look at recent court developments relevant to agriculture, including a ruling on the interest rate to be applied in a farm bankruptcy reorganization. And further ahead with his weekly commentary on life in rural Kansas, K-State's Gus Vander Hoeven. All that and more straight ahead on this Agriculture Today. For 25 years, K-State Research and Extension's Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services has been providing a no-cost, confidential place to call in and visit with an agricultural lawyer. Our experts are available to help you producers handle legal and financial issues. Explore your options and generate solutions. Call us at 800-321-3276 or visit us online. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today. We appreciate you joining us once again. And this first segment is for you winter wheat growers. It's that topic we bring up about this time every year. But as usual, there are differing considerations as we go year to year in talking about top dressing nitrogen on winter wheat. Along our way once more is Dorivar Ruiz-Diaz. As you know, Dorivar is a soil fertility specialist with K-State Research and Extension. If producers haven't already put down that top dress, they can be at least thinking about it in these coming weeks, Dorivar.
Yes, Eric, we're getting to that time of the year, and of course, when it comes to nitrogen, there are a few key things that we have to keep in mind. Some of the key points are typically related to the timing of that nitrogen application, also what kind of sources we have, what kind of fertilizer options we have for nitrogen, and then what about placement as well? Do we need to be thinking about, depending on the source that we are using, some pros and cons in terms of different placement, broadcasts, streamer bars, and that sort of thing. So typically, those are kind of the key points that we need to evaluate. And of course, every field will be different. We do have some challenges this year as well, and keeping that in mind.
Well, let's begin with timing, in that these applications will likely go on in the coming weeks. But you consider that the most important factor in getting a good return on the top dress application.
Yes, Eric, that's a key point. One of the factors we have to keep in mind is that we need to have that nitrogen in place when the wheat's going to start to grow and green up later this spring, making sure and putting that nitrogen early enough to be able to have some movement in the soil and available to the roots it's going to be critical. And that's typically one of the key points. We want to make sure we are not too late. But also at the same time, this year, in some parts of the state, we did have some late planted wheat, maybe very small wheat still at this point, maybe just emerging in some cases. In that kind of situation, we do have a little bit more time, and that's also important to keep in mind. We do have that time, and we have to ideally consider the yield potential. We do have moisture, which is good, but also again with late planted wheat, maybe the yield potential will be a little bit lower than previous years. So those are factors we have to keep in mind as we are thinking about timing. Again, making sure we're putting that nitrogen early enough to be able to get advantage of movement of that nitrogen, but also be careful and not go too early, and also missing in terms of maybe adjustments that we can make based on yield potential.
Does soil type play into that as well?
Absolutely, and that's another key factor, and that will be different for different fields. Obviously, producers, mostly in the western part of the state, fine, medium texture soil, we do have a little bit more flexibility. Those soils were going to hold nitrogen very well. So even if we go a little bit earlier, again, that soil will retain that nitrogen very well. Now, if we are dealing with maybe a little bit more sandy soil in the south central part of the state, for example, again, if we go too early, we have the risk of increasing potential for nitrogen losses. So we want to make sure and getting as close as possible to joining, obviously before joining, but closer to that growth stage for those sandier soils.
Well, typically, Dorivar, when we look at top dressing, we're looking at a broadcast application. That's the preferred method in most circumstances. There is an alternative, though, that producers could possibly consider, you say.
Yes, and again, in this case, we're talking about essentially dry versus liquid sources, and we're talking about liquid fertilizer, UAN, which tends to be one of the most common options. Broadcast tends to be fairly popular. In many cases, maybe we're putting herbicides in combination with that nitrogen. And in many cases, that would be appropriate, usually will do well. However, once we start talking about situations of no-till, residue cover, then we have an increased risk of nitrogen tie-up with broadcast application, and that becomes a challenge. So especially in that kind of scenario, and if we are not going to do any herbicide application, we would like to ideally be doing dribble apply. We can use things like streamer bars, nozzles that will basically minimize the contact of that UAN with the residue in the soil. And again, that will be a key application method where we essentially will minimize any potential tie-up. Also, by doing this type of application, we are helping that nitrogen to move into the soil a little bit better, minimizing any potential loss, perhaps to volatilization losses, which is another risk associated with that type of application. So those are a couple benefits of using things like streamer bars and streaming that UAN, especially, again, if we are not doing any herbicide application with that UAN.
But that leads into the next question about nitrogen source. You mentioned that the dribble band of liquid product is feasible in certain circumstances, but should one opt for one or the other of the two main end sources that are used out there?
That's an excellent question, and there are many things to keep in mind as we are choosing the source, and of course, price of the fertilizer is one of those. What's basically set up for that particular producer. You know, some producers are just basically set up to do more liquid. Others will be doing more dry fertilizer. So all of those will be factors, of course. But thinking about the agronomics specifically of dry versus liquid, there are some pros and cons. And if we are comparing, for example, dribble apply UAN versus dry urea, they tend to be pretty comparable in terms of efficiency. And we just talk about tie-up of nitrogen, for example. And by doing dribble UAN, again, we are moving that nitrogen into the soil a little bit better. We are getting also the same benefit from dry fertilizer by spreading, broadcasting dry fertilizer, essentially moving to any residue and getting in contact with the soil much better. So we do get very similar response and efficiency with dribble apply UAN compared to dry urea. Now, there's another factor, and I did mention a little bit potential for volatilization. And of course, if we're using dry urea, we can have a little bit higher risk of volatilization. However, I want to emphasize that for top dressing wheat, typically that's not a huge concern because we are talking lower temperature, and we don't have typically the ideal conditions for volatilization losses. We just completed a study recently where we look at volatilization from dry urea on cold weather situations, and generally we found a much lower risk of volatilization losses with top dressing wheat as compared, for example, to side dressing corn in the summer, where we're going to have typically a much higher volatilization losses. So that's one thing to also keep in mind. Again, of course, with the UAN, we have a lower risk of any volatilization losses.
Do want to have you weigh in on another option, though, that's out there, the controlled released products for specific soil types where that might be advantageous. Talk about that.
Yes, that's a very good point, and it's becoming more popular. I know many producers who are using on a regular basis slow-release products. One of them that's in the market is ESN, is a polymer-coated urea, specifically for situations where we have higher potential of nitrogen losses, again, sandier soils, or even soils that maybe will be more saturated during the spring months. It's an excellent product for that type of situation. Another potential benefit, and this is something to think about also from slow-release products, is that essentially it's providing nitrogen during the growing season. So that basically means some of that nitrogen will become available later in the growth stages, potentially helping with things like protein content and just providing that extra nitrogen late in the season.
The last thing we'll talk about today, it's not the least thing, though. That is the nitrogen rate to go with the top dress. That'll be predicated in part on what you might have applied earlier in the wheat production season last fall.
Absolutely, and that's really one thing to keep in mind. Of course, we in many cases, many producers already did some application, maybe some apply pre-plant or some level of nitrogen applied with the drill. In some cases, depending on the source, maybe with the phosphorus. So that's something that we have to keep in mind. But then on the other hand, we just talk about essentially the status of that wheat crop right now and what are the potential for yields moving forward, keeping in mind things like tillering, planting dates, soil moisture. Those will basically give us a little bit better estimate of what to think about in terms of nitrogen rates. Of course, we want to start with an idea of a nitrogen rate based on history, based on soil types, based on yield potential. And the main factor is really yield potential at this point. I think we have to evaluate every field and, if necessary, make adjustments to that nitrogen application rate. Again, if we do have the potential, we can up the rates a little bit more. If we are not seeing that potential for that particular field, we have the opportunity to cut back, in some cases, the rates. However, one thing that I always caution producers is not to cut back on rates so quickly and try to look at a little bit more in terms of what are the potentials moving forward. One thing that we are seeing in recent years in particular is that we did have excellent yields, which means in many cases we have very little nitrogen left in the soil. This is something that needs to go into our fertilizer recommendations and rates moving forward, especially in the western part of the state. In many cases, we don't have a lot of nitrogen left in the profile, which means we need to keep that in mind as we are moving forward this year. A lot of that because excellent yields last a couple years.
Well, all of these points and more are captured nicely in an article in the E-Update series on top-dress fertilization for winter wheat at agronomy.ksu.edu. And Dorivar, thanks for the input. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
That from crop nutrient specialist Dorivar Ruiz-Diaz, K-State Research and Extension, on this opening part of Agriculture Today.
While many people know hunger is an issue in developing countries, it is also a problem in our own backyards. In 2010, 1 in 7 Kansans struggled to put adequate food on the table. 2 K-State Research and Extension programs are tackling this problem. The Family Nutrition Program and Expanded Food and Nutrition Education Program reach thousands of Kansans in more than 70 counties. They learn how to eat healthy with a low budget. For more information about these programs, visit ksre.ksu.edu.
Welcome back. You're listening to Agriculture Today. And across the way, once again, is a professor of agricultural law and taxation at the Washburn University School of Law, who's with us regularly right here on the broadcast, Roger McEowen. Roger keeps track of agricultural law developments constantly and briefs us on those every other week right here. And Roger, you have another cross-section of things that we'll cover today, so we'll get right to them. The first is regarding a dairy farm which hit financial troubles, had to file for bankruptcy. And there's a process here on determining the interest rate at which that bankruptcy reorganization will be operated under?
Yeah, that's right. This is a dairy in the state of Washington. Usually we think of dairy operations in Wisconsin, New York, and in fact that's where the biggest increase in Chapter 12 bankruptcies has occurred over the past couple of years has been in Western District of Wisconsin, some of the upstate regions of New York where there are dairies that are really hurting. But this is not a Chapter 12 case, but it's a Chapter 11 case. But the principle that we're talking about here is exactly the same, and that is when you have some of your debt written off and you put together a reorganization plan, what is the interest rate that will attach to that reorganized loan that will make the creditor whole? It's a time value of money issue, and that's what was going on in this case.
So share the particulars on it. You had the two parties which disagreed on what that interest rate would be, in effect, right?
Well, back in 2004, the U.S. Supreme Court laid down a marker, and they said, here is the approach for determining what an interest rate is in a Chapter 11 case, which this is, as well as Chapter 12. So the principle applies in a farm bankruptcy Chapter 12 case also. So that's why this is important to talk about, even though it's not a Chapter 12 case. It's an 11. And the Supreme Court court back in 2004 said the appropriate method to determine that so-called cram-down interest rate is that we start with the prime interest rate in the economy. And that's our base point. And here in this case, it's 4.75%. That's where we're at right now or at the time of this case. And this is a decision 2 weeks ago. And then you add an additional amount based on the factors that are relevant for determining the risk associated with that particular debtor. So a dairy operation may have different risk factors than a cattle operation, than a hog operation, than a row crop operation does without livestock, so forth and so on. And that's determined by expert witnesses. And so the question was, what's that additional factor that we're going to add on to the 4.75% base amount? And, of course, the creditor is pushing for the highest that they could get was an additional 3% tack on. So they wanted 7.75%. The debtors are proposing a 6.0% interest rate. And basically what the court does was they kind of split the difference, and they said it's going to be 7%. And they said that that was fair to the creditors, fair to the debtor, because from the debtor's standpoint, it's going to increase the interest rate on some of their debts. It's going to lower the interest rate that was presently being applied to others of their debts. And so they just stuck it at 7%. But the instructive point here is how the courts go through the procedure of determining what your interest rate is going to be on your reorganized debt.
That was a case recently decided in Washington. I want to leap forward to a couple of other cases before we come back to one which is a little more lighthearted here, Roger, and that is two cases actually having to do with conservation easements used as a donation to a charitable entity. And that's a common practice, you say.
Yeah, it is. These are donations to land trusts. We have this in Kansas. So we have the Kansas Land Trust. We have various types of conservation organizations that actually solicit farmland easements on farmland, on ranch land, so that they can preserve conservation benefits permanently into the future. It might be a scenic view that we're protecting over, say, a river basin, something like that. Well, when you do that, of course, the land trust is a qualified charity as defined by the Internal Revenue Code. You can get a nice charitable deduction for that gift. And it is a permanent gift. It's a permanent easement. Now, you don't lose the agricultural use of your property. You can still graze the land. You can still farm the land. It just, you've lost the potential commercial development. That development of potential is gone. So the difference between those two values is essentially, and I'm oversimplifying it, but that is essentially what the value of the gift is, the loss of that use value. And that's what you donate to charity. And many of these gifts are multi-million-dollar gifts. Very common to see cases where we're up in the $20 million, $30 million, $40, $50 million. I've seen some well over $100 million of the gift. And it gets big. So the point being with respect to that, since it is such a large potential tax benefit, the IRS just doesn't give this away. The Congress has legislated in the code specific requirements that must be satisfied to the letter of the law, dot every I, cross every T. And the IRS has very specific regulations when these types of gifts are made that must be satisfied, or they can wipe out the entire value of that charitable deduction.
And that's what has happened in each of these two separate cases now. They are following different tracks as far as errors in procedure, to put it that way.
IRS is hot on the trail of these. They view a lot of these transactions as what they call abusive transactions. That means they don't like them. They will audit all of these, and you better be precisely correct on the way that the deed granting the easement to the charity is drafted, and that every subpoint of the regulations are satisfied. We've already got 2 cases this year out of the tax court in which the taxpayer has now lost both cases, lost their entire charitable deduction on each of these. And one is when you give property to a charity that's $5,000 or more, you must have a qualified appraisal go with that, and a tax return. You have to show that. And there are numerous requirements that must also accompany that, one of which is you have to show what your income tax basis is in that donated property. The most recent case, just late last week, was a situation where you had an $8 million charitable gift involving timberland down in Georgia, and they didn't include that income tax basis information. Everything else was correct, but for the lack of the income tax basis information on that land, which was donated at $21,000 per acre for an $8 million gift, they got a 0 charitable deduction.
Wow. very painful. And the other one, where did they, so to say, drop the ball in the proceedings?
This was a $16 million deduction that was claimed on the return, and the deed granting the easement contained a clause specifying the result if the easement were extinguished as the result of a court order. And you have to plan for that contingency. There may be something that happens out into the future that a court will order the easement extinguished. Well, the charity still has to get a prescribed benefit of a certain amount, even if that happens. And there is a specific formula that's set forth in the code, because from the time of the gift to the time that the court extinguishes the easement, the value may go up on that property. The charity is to share in that appreciation in value. You just cannot peg the value of your gift as of the date of the transfer and leave it at that if the court would later extinguish it. And that's what happened. They had bad language in the deed. They didn't account for the proper formula for allowing appreciation in value, some of that to be captured by the charity. They lost a $16 million charitable deduction as a result of that. So if you've got a taxpayer that's, say, in a 40%, I'll round it off, 40% federal income tax bracket, you're looking at 40% of $16 million. That's the tax dollars, the tax benefit that you lost. And that's what, about $6.5 million or something like that, $7 million out of $16 million. That's this is not petty cash that we're playing with on these things. People have to be very careful, and IRS is really looking at these.
The last item here, mentioning earlier, it was somewhat lighthearted, but you really shouldn't say that too flippantly, because it was a liability suit against an individual who had sheep. And anybody that's been around sheep or goats understands their behavior. This was a guard sheep. Fill in the details from
Well, that's right. Lammy was the name of the guard sheep. Actually, I think this is I've been doing this 30 years. This is the first guard sheep case I think I have ever dealt with. I had to read it a couple of times. They actually have a lamb in the house acting as what they called a guard sheep because they'd had prior break-ins at this farmhouse. Now, the lamb is friendly but territorial, and the court said it would headbutt the owner as well as the owner's girlfriend when agitated, but did so in a playful manner. Well, they had people come out to the farm on business, and on one occasion they weren't there to make sure the lamb stayed away from the guests as they were coming, and the lamb did headbutt the guest out in the outer yard. It was actually in a fenced-in yard. It wasn't inside the house at that point in time. Knocked the individual over. Individual gets hurt. There's a lawsuit, and so the question is, are you liable for the butting lamb? And the court looked at the facts and they said, well, they really never had any evidence that the lamb would hurt anyone. It was always just kind of a playful headbutt. And so they weren't negligent, and there was no strict liability because they weren't on notice that they had a problem with Lammy. Most of the time, the courts will say it's not strict liability unless the animal, particularly in Kansas, is a Rottweiler or a Pit Bull. You have to be careful with certain species of animals, but generally, no, not unless you're on notice.
But these individuals were invited on the property to provide a service.
They were.
And so that's something to think about as an operator, landowner.
Right, and that will, in many instances, heighten your responsibility of a landowner. But generally, the first butt is free, so to speak. You're not on notice until that happens.
Well put. As always, Roger, a pleasure. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Eric.
Roger McEowen is a professor of agricultural law and taxation at the Washburn University School of Law. Keep track of these and other similar topics in the field from his blog, which is at washburnlaw.edu/WALTR. And we'll return shortly with more on Agriculture Today.
Did you eat today? Thank a farmer. A way to get more involved in agriculture is through 4-H and FFA. Through 4-H and FFA, we have been given multiple opportunities to grow as leaders and learn more about agriculture.
You can learn skills related to jobs, public speaking skills, and you get the opportunity to travel around the country and meet new people.
If you want more information about getting more involved in 4-H and FFA, visit them on their websites at kansasffa.org and kansas4h.org.
You're listening to the Wednesday edition of Agriculture Today, coming to you from the campus of Kansas State University. Eric Atkinson here. And next up, today's agricultural news headlines for you, these courtesy in part of DTN. A former House Agriculture Committee chief economist, who's now a professor at Texas A&M University, Bart Fisher, said yesterday that he disagrees with the claim of Senate Agriculture Committee ranking member Debbie Stabenow that the Trump administration's market facilitation program trade aid payments disproportionately benefited the South. Stabenow announced yesterday that the Government Accountability Office has launched an investigation into the administration's trade aid based on her request, showing a chart of states where the MFP money went at the Crop Insurance Industry Annual Convention. Fisher pointed out that of the top 10 states in MFP payments, Texas was the only one from the South. Michigan was not one of the top 10, however, he noted. And he went on to say it was not about picking regional winners and losers, in his words. It was the unforgiving formula based on export losses, acreage, and yields. Stabenow has frequently charged that the aid program was biased, providing more funds per acre to farmers in southern states that voted for the president and favored large and foreign agriculture companies over small farms. Stabenow's office released an analysis last week showing the highest payments per acre states were Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, Arkansas, Tennessee, and Louisiana. Fisher told the crop insurers he believed the undercurrent of regional inequity came about because the payments for corn were so low, particularly in the first 2018 round of payments, the first round of trade aid based solely on the decline in U.S. exports to China that year. Soybean growers, whose exports did plummet, got the biggest payments, while the corn payment was comparatively tiny. For 2019, the Trump administration took into consideration the longer-term trade problems, which increased payments to corn growers, but also for cotton growers likewise. And Fisher did acknowledge there were inequities in the program, but said that the most important problem was for producers of exported commodities who are in counties in which the main commodity produced was not exported as much. China, meantime, will allow companies to apply for tariff exemptions on nearly 700 U.S. products as of March the 2nd, with several agricultural products on that list, including pork, beef, soybeans, denatured ethanol, wheat, corn, and sorghum. The announcement from the Ministry of Finance indicated that imports are still to be based on market conditions, and companies can apply to have other products added to the list of goods that are eligible for tariff exemptions. The ministry will approve application within 3 working days, and buyers must get approval before their cargoes clear customs. The EPA is currently consulting with the White House and the Department of Justice on the potential impact of the recent court ruling that 3 small refinery exemptions granted by the EPA in the 2016 RFS compliance did not meet requirements under the Renewable Fuel Standard, according to a report from Reuters. The report said the decision would be made by March the 9th. The court ruled that the 3 in question did not meet RFS law, which said they require any SREs granted after 2010 to have to be an extension. The agency aims to have an announcement by March the 9th. Again, according to the report, the EPA and the Department of Justice are reviewing the decision, carefully considering its potential impact on the program. That according to EPA spokesperson Molly Block. The number of SREs requested and granted by the EPA has risen sharply in recent years. Some of those SREs are potentially impacted by the court decision, with EPA Administrator Andrew Wheeler telling reporters recently that the action has the potential to impact the small refinery exemption process entirely. Well, U.S. meat production is projected higher in 2020, according to the latest USDA outlook. Here's an update on that from the USDA's Gary Crawford.
Meat production in this country seems to increase every year, year after year. Now, it would be a big story if that trend were to end. But I suppose U.S. meat output in 2020 is going to go up again, right?
Absolutely.
Oh, okay. Well, that's USDA Acting Outlook Board Chairman Mark Jekanowski, so I guess no big story for me this time. But maybe there's a story here after all when you look at the actual USDA 2020 forecast for total meat production. You see what is a
pretty healthy increase year over year of about 3.3 5-6 billion pounds.
Up to almost 109 billion pounds, about 3% more than last year. And the two commodities responsible for most of the increase?
Broilers and pork.
So those two commodities, broilers and pork, projected to contribute just over 3 billion pounds of the expected 3.5 billion pound increase in total meat production this year. Gary Crawford for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Washington.
Now, following up on that, the USDA has also offered its latest 10-year forecast on production, price, and exports of meat and dairy products. Here's more from the USDA's Rod Bain.
Consumer demand for livestock and poultry products is expected to remain strong, according to USDA's latest 10-year projections for agriculture. Economist David Busios says while both red meat and poultry production are expected to increase over the next decade,
in terms of trade, we could see a continuing expansion of our export numbers as we continue to advance and the world advances with higher incomes and greater demand for livestock,
with strong domestic demand as well. However, increased feed prices over the next 10 years are expected to narrow feed price ratios. Prices received by beef and broiler producers will decline near the end of the decade, with pork prices received remaining steady during that same time period. Milk production is also expected to increase over the 10-year projection period, and while dairy farm prices are forecasted to decline initially, they are then expected to increase during the middle and later years of the forecast time frame. I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
And finally, with the latest on a story that was reported earlier in the week, a federal court has in fact granted environmental groups' request to stay a lawsuit challenging the EPA's repeal of the 2015 Waters of the U.S. rule. That according to a ruling handed down yesterday. The U.S. District Court for the District of South Carolina has granted the South Carolina Coastal Conservation League a 75-day stay after that group filed a motion last Friday. The EPA and the Army Corps of Engineers signed that final new rule back on January the 23rd. It's set to take effect 60 days from that date. The lawsuit in South Carolina claims that the federal agencies violated the Administrative Procedure Act in promulgating the repeal rule and merely reverting it back to the 1986 rule instead of reintroducing it for public comment. That's a look at today's agricultural news headlines, and we'll be back with more shortly here on Agriculture Today.
Hamburgers, roast, ribs, steak, or whatever you prefer. Beef, it's what's for dinner. Kansas cattle farmers produce 7.5 million head of cattle per year. It takes about 7 tablespoons of peanut butter to get the same amount of protein in 1 serving of lean beef. Support your local Kansas farmers and ranchers. Eat beef. This message was brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
This is Agriculture Today. Stop, look, and listen.
If you want to hear birds sing, you must create habitat.
That's Gus Vanderhoeven of Kansas State University with comment on life in rural Kansas.
Walking to the mailbox, there was spring in the air. We've had some cold, windy weather, but the other day it did feel different and it sounded different. The birds sang a different tune. I heard a cardinal sing and listened. It sounded like the territorial song. Maybe I'm fooled, but the morning was warmer. There was no wind and the sun was shining. It's getting towards the end of February, and like the almanac says, I still have half of my fireplace wood supply. And that means I will make it through the winter nicely. Each evening we burn the fireplace, and on the weekends we start the fire early. I've already started on next year's supply of woodpile. It is a good start. There's time to complete that job. I had planned to go to the farm and cut a few loads while our Dutch family friend is here, but I don't think that will happen, as my good dog warned me to let torn muscles heal and to be careful. I think I'll listen this time. I'll cut more wood later with some of the grandsons. They may like that, and I know I will. With the Dutch family, I will walk the farm and look for sheds or fallen antlers. That is, if coyote hasn't chewed on them already, or for that matter the mice or pack rats. I also must investigate how much more damage brother or sister beaver has done chewing down trees near the wildlife pond. The last time I looked, it surely looked as if foresters had been clearing the woods. The chewed-on trees will sprout again, and deer will love the fresh shoots. The farm, hilly as it is surely no 400 acres of wheat as in western Kansas. It is rough, but fascinating country, with up and downs and trails. A great place to walk. Of most antlers I have laying about, I still know where and how I found them. I find it exhilarating to walk onto the fallen antlers. Only a few times was I able to find the other one and make it a matched pair. For one pair it took a whole year to find the match. A year later I found the second one on one of the cow paths on the range. As I picked it up, I knew it was a match. Another job I have to do quickly is burn the 3-acre patch of brome, which did not get harvested last year as the creek had jumped the bank and flooded out over the brome field. In the process, it dumped stumps and branches on that acreage. It's a cleaning job which needs to be done before the growing season starts. I will have to line up some grandson's help for that too. In the fall, you relax and feel you can breathe deeply. All growth slows down and the immediate hurry is over. Then there is the holiday season and some nice snowfalls. But all that now, as it seems, a long time ago. A man is getting anxious. I have to mow the tall and still standing prairie grasses on the hill here near the house. I can't burn it. My neighbor would be shocked if I did. If I ever find the right hearing aid, I might be surprised hearing the birds sing. The high notes I don't hear anymore. The buzzing of the bees I don't hear. When my wife calls me, I don't hear. Maybe I don't listen. There's a difference, listening or hearing. I have to stop by my lawnmower mechanical man and I see if he was able to get the push mower going. I suggested we put another engine on it. He didn't think it was a bad idea. He would look at it over the winter. I took it to him in the fall and he said to see him in March. Well, just like with the bird songs, March is creeping up on us, and before you know it, there will be the ear-shattering noise of lawnmowers again, or if kept tuned, a happy purring as the cut grass flies out from under the deck. Mowing is a summer job. I'm glad I do have a riding mower now. It's not a new one, but it does the job quite well. I must admit, with the amount of grass I have to mow, I would immediately get another one. A good one. It's no luxury for an old man. The local paper had an article which I laid aside. The question asked was under real estate, and it was, it's so hard to keep up with landscaping. Can I go with a more wild look? I'll talk about that another day, but the fact is, the simplest landscape maintenance is to have grass and keep it mowed. Have a mower to match the job, and the yard work is simplified. However, do I like that landscape? And the answer is no. That is why I love and enjoy our farm. It's made up of diverse land. The same with the landscape around our house. I like the design diversity which creates the habitat for all that lives. And by the way, there's still enough time to sit down and do some planning if you want to improve your backyard. And remember, large or small, we tend to have 4 yards. There's the front and the backyard. But there are also 2 side yards which link the front and back together. There are a few extension publications which may be of help, and there's plenty of other literature to get you started. If you want to hear birds sing, you must create habitat.
Gus Vander Hoeven of Kansas State University with his weekly commentary on life in rural Kansas. And that's our time for today. As always, thanks to you for listening in. Eric Atkinson here. This has been Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.